we've had a great couple of days. We're chatting about different aspects of privacy. So we started on day one, looking at it more from like a user personal perspective. What are we concerned about? What does privacy mean? You know, why is it more important now than ever? And how has digitization affected that?
Yep.
That was a nice eye-opening conversation. And then we moved on to yesterday onto the idea of, well, you know, okay, what can be done to try and help increase privacy? You know, things, and obviously regulation is one of the things, but we started looking more widely at that, looking at third-party fiduciaries, maybe even customers more voices at panels, at like a privacy customer panel or something along those lines. So it was an enjoyable discussion and debate that we had. Now today we're looking at, well, I know a lot of people have been sharing their thoughts in the class. You know, we've had an online classroom discussion as well about what they feel they will do when they go back, or examples of things that we can learn from in terms of violations of privacy. Yeah, and we're pretty much trying to wrap up the session with some thoughts from you and your brand new research, because it's good for all of us to learn something brand new. So the pressure's on, Daryl. We're all super excited to hear some of your thoughts, and obviously the community can then chip in and you know, if you have any questions that you'd like, or feedback or comments you'd like to hear, we will be online to share those with you.
Awesome. Awesome. Brilliant. Well, that's exactly what I'm looking for, is feedback, thoughts. I don't get it. That doesn't make sense. Have you thought of this? Because it's exactly at this stage of that stage of the research where I can really use some of that.
Perfect. Well, you're at the right place. We've got some really intelligent and well-read members of the community here on those issues, so I'm sure they'll be very happy to contribute.
Great. All right, so should we go ahead and get started? Should I share my screen? What do you think?
Absolutely. Let's get going, and then if people are a little bit late, they can join and catch up as they arrive.
Okay. All right. So everybody can see, I would assume at this point.
Yes.
Yes.
So this is a readout presentation that I did for PayPal. So this work has been sponsored by PayPal, but it's sponsored through their government relations and social impact work. It hasn't been commissioned to feed right into their business, although obviously that's wonderful. I have been trying to feed into the business because at the start of the year, they really had a lot of privacy weeks and they had a lot of focus on privacy. And then obviously COVID has sort of caught their attention. And so in some ways, this work I put on hold because it was really hard to talk to people about privacy when everything with COVID is happening. So this was a presentation that I gave to a number of different groups at PayPal, and then also within their data privacy group that actually happens to be based in Chennai. So I came down and I did a presentation to them, got a lot of great feedback. And the premise of this, and it comes in a couple phases. This is the end of phase 1, and I'm about to start phase 2. And I'll talk a little bit about what I'm planning in phase 2 in just a moment. But phase 1 was really about sort of setting out a bit of a problem. I went to PayPal last year because I read a book called Privacy as Trust. And it's by a professor at New York Law School called Ari Ezra Waldman, who I just find that everything he produces on this topic is just very insightful. I love the way that he thinks. He's been one of my like North Stars in this work. And privacy as trust really pulls away from this idea that you have in the regulation, especially with GDPR and the California law coming up, of the focus of notice and consent. And there's some part of this work that looks at notice and consent and says, well, when should notice come up, and how much detail, and how long should it be, and what type of consent should there be, and how should it be written? There's a whole bunch of sort of nitpicking notice and consent. And that's how to solve data privacy. And a lot of his work and the work of others like Nissenbaum says, well, wait a minute, we're losing the main sense of what privacy really means. And we're also losing an opportunity because large digital platforms are constantly trying to gain trust among their consumers. And privacy is a big part of that trust. It's not everything, but it's part of it. And if you can win the battle for privacy, you start to win the battle for trust. And if there's a big trust focus coming in the next years, this is a battleground that you can really start to earn the trust of consumers. So the other thing I did was I looked, and this is where I start with this problem. When I look at the data privacy surveys that are out there, and there's a number that are done by big consulting companies, and then there are a few that are done by governments, one or two that are done by think tanks like Pell and others, which frankly I do find much better. But generally speaking, those data privacy surveys, they put everybody into the same box. And they essentially say, are you worried about data privacy? And the answer is yes. And okay, then a company doesn't really know what to do about that. And it's not getting under sort of this erosion of trust problem. So I feel like we have an opportunity now to really understand, well, what does create trust around privacy? What do we know about consumers' knowledge and their preferences, their opinions about their privacy? And this is the kicker, in different contexts. So if you look at the overall portfolio, so to speak, of digital interactions that people have, do they have the same concerns and knowledge about privacy on their e-commerce digital interactions versus their social media versus their general communication? And how much do they know along that string? Like, are they concerned about Facebook, but then are they also thinking about the ISP that they're using in their home, on their Wi-Fi in their home, their internet service provider? Are they thinking about the device that they're using to get onto Facebook? Are they thinking about all the different providers in this chain of using that product, which usually that's something that gets neglected. So what we're developing is a new interview methodology. And, I really don't know that much about digital privacy. I'm not a digital privacy expert, but I am an expert in understanding how people think about really complex things in their lives. And that's how I'm trying to contribute to the conversation, to use an interview methodology to map a whole consumer portfolio and then in context, understand what they think about different parts of those portfolios. Ultimately, I'm thinking maybe this could become sort of a data empowerment portal where you could look across your portfolio, you could see where the weakest parts of your privacy are across your entire portfolio, how to mitigate privacy breaches in some way or to protect yourself in the most important parts of that portfolio, and ultimately maybe design interventions to increase knowledge and increase change. A lot of this work has reminded me of like financial education, financial literacy. And in my opinion, having looked at how hard it is to change behavior in financial services and in financial management, the idea of changing digital behavior is easier because it's a one-off change. It's not a sustained behavioral change. The change that you're trying to get somebody to make is change a setting, change a practice, which will probably get repeated. I feel like the bar is a little bit lower. The problem is that what we usually get in terms of advice about how to protect your privacy is this big, long laundry list. And it's agnostic to what people actually use most often, and it's agnostic to people's preferences and their concerns. All right, let me stop there at sort of the whole premise of all this work. Any questions so far? Any comments? Any thoughts? Okay, let me keep going. So I'm going to go over sort of some of the reflections from the literature. What thinking can we bring, looking at the existing data privacy surveys, talking about a new research methodology. So I did develop you know, a little bit of an app to test new methodology, and then what I'm thinking is going to happen next. There's a lot of really interesting ideas around how we think about philosophies of privacy. What are the mental models? And so, for example, the more important ones are this fatalism. Oh, privacy can't be controlled. It doesn't exist. Everybody knows everything about us. Fatalism is everywhere to a greater or lesser extent. I think that some parts of the portfolio, people feel more fatalism than others. And I think fatalism also is higher among those who are more technically savvy, and more involved in the technical world. And I'm also starting to think that fatalism is what we have to battle if what we want to talk about is data empowerment. Because fatalism says, well, we can't do anything about it. Why even bother about regulation, advocacy, and protecting ourselves? So fatalism is a really big philosophy that I find comes up quite often to a greater or lesser extent, depending on what part of the portfolio you're talking about and what type of person, what segment of the population you're thinking of. There's a lot on trade-off. In other words, people do talk in terms of trade-offs within, like, I will sacrifice privacy in one part of my portfolio, but the trade-off will be completely different in another part. So for example, one woman said to me, there's this, in the US and other places as well, you share your DNA and they tell you all about your background and you know, where you come from. Very popular in the US and very melting pot type of thing. So you share your DNA, it's pretty, you know, you're really exposing quite a lot of yourself. And one woman said, yeah, I know, it's weird. I'll do that. I'll share my DNA, but I won't use Facebook. And the reason why I won't use Facebook is because I'm so concerned of what happened in the 2016 US elections, and I don't want to be manipulated. And I know it's weird because I'll share my DNA, but I won't use Facebook, but those are my trade-offs. That's what I'm thinking. So trade-offs come in all sorts of different ways. There's even sort of personal responsibility, and I hear this among sort of lower income households. Oh, I know I shouldn't do that. Oh, it's my own fault. So there's a sense of people wanting to do something to protect themselves, which I take as a good sign, frankly. So those are just a few. I find that most people do not have one philosophy. They have different philosophies for different parts of their portfolios and in different circumstances. So there's a lot of layers to people's philosophies around data privacy within their overall digital portfolio. Another thing I think that's really helpful is these mental models. What are the symbols that people are thinking of? So is it a do not disturb sign? Is it what they want? Is it what they could have if they had their druthers? What would they have? How is it now? A lot of people talk about a door that they can close, but they can also open it when they want. There's a shell in here. This was people talking about a turtle. If they wanted to cover themselves, they could go into their shells. There usually is some sort of openness though around. There's a way to open. There's a way to expose. And so those mental models, getting out of words and into symbols, I think is really helpful for describing how people feel about their data privacy. And then the last concept that I want to talk about is this privacy calculus, and it gets a bit deeper into the trade-off philosophy. And this is talked about a lot in academic papers, but there's very few papers that test what privacy calculus might be in different contexts. And for the purpose of this methodology, as it turns out, PayPal has acquired a new company called Honey. And Honey is it's something that you add into your browser, and as you go onto e-commerce sites, it will search for discounts. But obviously, you're sharing something about your browsing experience, but then you'll get a discount. And that was really nice because you could say to a respondent, well, if you have this browser extension, what type of discount would you want? And they could give a percentage answer. And those were very wide. I'd like to understand more about why people said, oh, I need a 10% discount, or I'd need a 25. I need a larger sample to really figure out, well, why did people have the discounts that they had? There wasn't a lot of consistency in the responses. So overall, a lot of what this is kind of getting at for me, looking at this, big, huge literature, which is sprawling all over the place, is that inherently ensuring privacy builds trust. And from that trust comes several different needs. And here are the ones that I've picked up. There's definitely, oh, sorry, go right ahead. Oh, was there a question or a comment? Okay, let me go ahead.
Yeah, go for it, Daryl.
Okay, I think within that trust, there's protect me, which is security. There's don't expose me, and this is what we usually think of as privacy. Like, don't sell or share my data. Don't just expose me when I'm not expecting it. And don't manipulate me, which is getting back to the US 2016 election and Cambridge Analytica. There are probably more needs. And that's part of what I want to explore in this phase too. I don't think that list is it. But when we tend to think about privacy, or the way that I think about it in the literature, or when we think about companies, first and foremost, we think about security. And then within the regulations, it has to do with don't expose me. We learn about misinformation and we're nervous about that. And we're thinking about how to deal with it. That's the don't manipulate me. But what else are consumers thinking as they're engaging with digital tools and they're wondering what their exposure is and what risks are they taking with their privacy? So let me stop there. Any thoughts, questions, comments?
Thanks, Daryl. That was really interesting. Covered a lot of ground there. Let me just start with a couple of questions to give people a little bit of a chance to organize their thoughts and prepare their own questions. The first one is, I mean, obviously the idea of privacy as trust is extremely appealing. The question is it enough? I tend to look at privacy. You said that privacy discussions have resonate a lot with you on with discussions on literacy, financial education, and so on. But to me, I tend to look at privacy very much as an extension of consumer protection. So first question is that right? And secondly, if that is so, then I'm sure you would agree that just solving consumer protection with just trust is not enough, because the incentives of the operators are just, or the providers sometimes are just too big, and they'll try to harm the customers, knowing that they're harming the customer because I can, and that's differential pricing, miscommunicating benefits, all sorts of things that on the face of it violate trust. So what can you give me about consumer protection in general that gives me faith that it can be addressed as a fundamentally a trust issue?
I mean, to be honest, I don't think regulation is going to go nearly far enough. I mean, it's always something of a blunt tool. And unfortunately, the regulation that we're dealing with really, I feel like it goes down a rabbit hole of notice and consent. And the regulators say, well, you need to provide enough notice and consumers need to give their consent. And let's talk about that wording, and let's talk about where it is, and let's talk about, and then you start to spiral down into a user interface discussion about when notice and consent comes up and have consumers been notified. And I think on top of that, there needs to be a layer, and this is the reason why it reminds me of financial education, is some part of financial education is about debt and what are you signing up for, and when you get a loan, have you been informed? Well, if if you don't have a consumer that understands to a certain extent what is happening with their digital data, then you don't have a consumer who understands where to advocate. So for example, some of the better studies that I've seen come from Australia, and they ask consumers, where do you go to complain if you think that your privacy has been breached in some way that is against the law? Where can you go for more information? And a lot of consumers at this point really don't know. Now that's sort of the bare basic, but the reason why I put it into sort of a data privacy or financial literacy is because, once again, I think it's an interface of a consumer, usually sort of a lower, especially the newly digitized, with some sort of big institution. And the consumer needs to understand what is within the law and which not, and to understand what exactly is happening. And
Right.
so how do you message that? And that's where I think the experimental work could be helpful. What do you understand? What do you not understand? And to be honest, this is what this work really started as, where I think that a lot of people really have no idea what providers take their data and what they do with it. There's the media is doing a good job about saying this is what happens when on this type of product, but then it creates a lot of hype about what's going on with that product. I also think that there is a business incentive where, so certainly obviously it's not everywhere, but that's why it's been so interesting to work with PayPal on this, albeit it's a model that its business model doesn't depend on this quite as much as others, as Facebook, et cetera. But there is definitely a connection between privacy and trust that I was hearing picked up. I think the devil is in the details of then trying to implement. How do you get that across to the engineers and the designers, and how do you get privacy designers sitting next to engineers? How do you put this beyond just compliance within an institution? Because compliance is just another way of making sure the company doesn't breach the regulatory environment. And it doesn't really help. It doesn't build trust. It doesn't, it's a tick box. It's compliance. It's an extra cost center. It's not built into the design. So I guess my point around this is I'd be really distressed if we were tinkering only within the regulations.
Yes, and in the last 2 days, we all came up with that conclusion as well. Let me just summarize the last couple of days for your benefit, but also others who might be here who may not have been able to call. But the first day, really, the main theme that came out is something you just said, which is it's just a matter of incentives, and incentives can be very strong. Obviously, there's an incentive to keep your customer as happy as possible, but sometimes there's incentives that are not aligned with that. And that's when it becomes a problem. So, you know, like misusing their data, using their own data in order to misprice or price more expensively because I know something about you, that kind of stuff. Which is why consumer protection and privacy are very, very linked. So incentives can be extremely strong to not always do the right thing by the customer, even if their incentive to do right by the customer is also there. On the second day, which is more about solutions, I think what we ended up with there's such an imbalance of power between the provider and the individual consumer that makes those incentives impossible to align through any kind of market discipline, unless there's some mechanism for banding together the consumers, some kind of collective action, which regulation is in effect a form of that, but a very indirect. But we came up with two. One is the privacy fiduciaries, which I'm sure you're familiar with, third parties that would handle things on your behalf, and hence would gain some kind of power to kind of not force, but encourage companies to be more privacy friendly, because otherwise too many people will deny that will not want that service. And the other idea that we came up with is some kind of consumer board, privacy board, that is a representative of consumers through some kind of process. And so those people are empowered on behalf of the collective of consumers to find out more about the privacy policies, to audit potentially their implementation, to basically to be the point of contact for a conversation with a company about how that can impair the trust, and to make that very visible, because you're aggregating consumer power. So these have been the discussions that we've been having over the last couple of days, which I think links a lot into what you're saying, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, where I'm heading is not necessarily in the, what do we do about it? What is the state of the world in terms of what consumers think? How in the dark are they? Where are their preferences? It may be that in certain parts of the portfolio, they're absolutely fine with ad targeting, for example. But, I spoke to one sort of lower income consumer who was very exposed in her portfolio. You could nitpick and say, oh my God, you're doing this, you're doing that. But the big thing that she was surprised about and what upset her is that her internet service provider was taking her data and selling it. And her big problem was, she had no idea, it never occurred to her, her big problem was, but my bill's so high. And she couldn't get over it. She kept coming back to it during the interview. Oh my gosh, I can't believe that Verizon's doing this. And so in many ways, I started out thinking, what is the lay of the land? What are people's knowledge? And once they have that knowledge, what do they think? Where are they willing to give and take? And that helps us to lean into the parts of the portfolio and the aspects of data privacy that seem to be the most important to different segments. And I'm particularly concerned about the newly digitized. And so the what to do about it may end up being shot in the wrong way if we don't diagnose what consumers are most worried and concerned and shocked and horrified and disempowered within their own digital portfolios.
Right.
So
okay, thanks. Let's open up to students, Sarah, if you like. I see Amar has his hand up. Daryl, Amar comes from a country that has absolutely no privacy rules at all. And that's what he's been inquiring about in the last couple of days, and that's Sudan. So Amar, with that, please unmute yourself and say your thing.
Thanks, Ignacio. Yes, I read Professor Waldman book, Privacy at Trust, and one concept that really struck me was the concept of reciprocal trust. And as I remember, alluded to an example of a dating website. So in our culture in this part of the world, reciprocal trust is the norm.
Yep.
So how do you see that in the context of building a privacy sort of regulation or privacy act? How do you separate social norms from legal and regulatory aspects?
I think that part of what, and it's really interesting that you've read the book. I mean, at the end of the day, Waldman is a legal scholar, and I'm not a legal person. I'm an economist. And yet I was able to read this book. It's kind of dense, yet I found it really interesting. And he makes a very specific legal argument about privacy being not so much in the realm of regulations. If you break this rule, you will be punished, and more in the realm of torts. In other words, it's a contract between a consumer and a company. And I think the only thing I don't know whether that's right or not. I feel like I'm not necessarily in the right position to answer that, but it does tell me that there's a one size does not fit all. I think it does depend on what sort of what the cultural environment is like, and therefore what the legal environment is like. And it may be that, and I think at the moment there's so much, from what I've read and looked at, there's so much of taking the European laws and finding a way of adapting them to a lot of different countries. And I don't know if that's necessarily going to be helpful or if it's going to take up a lot of bandwidth and energy and political will and not necessarily be the right solution. And therefore, I don't know if you would agree with that, given where you come from.
Not necessarily fully agree with it. What confused me about the book was, although he's a legal scholar, but he's a sociologist as well, right?
Yes.
So I saw a lot of fuzzy areas that he was not really able to explain between social context and the legal context, and that's what I wanted to ask and clarify from you.
Yeah. The other thing he's tackled is the organizational environment. So, for example, he's done interviews across some of the big technology companies here in the US, and he's made the point that, look, a number of companies have made a big splash about having privacy compliance, and those are the lawyers. And if he talks to technologists, they do care about privacy, but they're thinking about security. So he found that technologists worried about security and they want to make sure that people's data is safe. And then the lawyers were worried about compliance, but nobody was worried about design and building trust. So in many ways, part of what he's doing is to think about how do you build this into the legal frameworks and into organizational structures to try to get away from just thinking that if we tick the box on security and notice and consent, we're done. We've done our job, because we haven't. It's going to come back. Any other comments or thoughts? Emma, but this is really helpful, and you've given me some thought around some of these ideas. Thank you.
Anyone else got any questions? Pop your hand up or just unmute yourself and you can just join the conversation. We've got a hand up from SM Morshed. Please unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you for giving me the opportunity for us to write down the chat box that when we have to first of all getting from.
We're having a little bit of trouble hearing you. Are you able to perhaps try and speak a little louder? We're really trying to hear your voice.
Okay, sorry for that. Am I audible now?
Yes, that's much better.
Sorry for that. Maybe technical problem here. I have already wrote my question to the chat box because of my network problem here. I have a question that when we going to install a software or application from Play Store or another sources, they ask some permission and they offer us to read the privacy condition. Then that time, most of the time, we unable to read their terms and conditions because that was too lengthy, and whether we are not sure whether they are getting our personal information or not. Last few months ago, I thought they access our Google Photo link. They want the permission to delete or edit the data of or photo of our Google Photos. Then that time I got scared and uninstalled most of the app which is not frequently used. Why? In this case, what will be the action from our side not to expose ourselves, because privacy is a trust. Actually, what I learned just a few minutes ago. So what will be our action? Because we have to do our day-to-day work. We have to make our life simple using some apps. Thank you. I think you can got my question. Thank you. What will be our action?
I think that that's part of what I'm trying to understand. And I think it's probably multiple actions. So part of what you're talking about is these very lengthy privacy policies. There's research that estimated that if everyone read the entirety of a privacy policy, they would spend, I don't know, up to several months, right, of their time if they read every single privacy policy of every single app, right? It's a lovely number. It's really, really helpful. And that's where the discussion of getting, what can you exclude? How short can these things be? And some of the surveys very helpfully say, do you read all of your privacy apps, or do you do all the privacy policies that you see, or do you read them all the way through? So I think there's some work to be done about shortening those or making them more accessible. But I still don't think that that's going to be enough. I think that there's going to be different ways of better understanding exactly what you're letting yourself in for. And part of what I'm trying to find out is, what do people think? What do they look for? What are they nervous about? So that maybe we can be more targeted about approaching privacy in ways in addition to these long privacy notices. All that work about how to shorten them and where to put them and what to tell consumers, that's going to go on. Part of what I'm more concerned about is diagnosing the consumer. What worries them the most? Where should we focus our work? So maybe let me go on a bit and show you some of the, the research tool and some of the results. Should I share my screen again, or was I already?
Please share again. I unstopped because it was nicer to see everyone.
Don't worry about it.
There we go.
So I guess that my big problem, I won't dwell on the privacy surveys. There's 7 different surveys that I reviewed over a number of different countries. First of all, they don't deal with emerging markets nearly enough. But even those that are in these developed markets, they don't ask context-specific questions. So when you ask questions about privacy and what you know and what bothers you, I can't imagine that specific providers have any idea about whether survey responses apply to them or not. And they're very inconsistent as well. I think in these surveys, having been a researcher of consumers, I just feel like the responses I see from privacy surveys show that consumers are bored, or they're confused, or they're embarrassed to say, I don't know. I don't know what I'm exposing myself to, which is a very natural thing. A lot of these are online surveys. There's some exceptions from Gallup and Pew, but those surveys are purely focused on Facebook and Google. So I'm finding it difficult to really understand what consumers think and what they're concerned about and where's their focus. So I created this methodology where first I really wanted to collect the whole consumer portfolio. And the way that, and even just doing that, I found really helpful. Is that possible? Can you ask consumers questions and then say, okay, here's everything that you do. And here are the most important things that you do. Here are the things that you do every day. Here's how you do them. Here's the channel that you use, the device that you use, the products that you use. So it really needs to be across the whole, what I call a product pathway. You can't just talk about a product, Facebook, et cetera. You need to talk about what connection you use, what channel, and what device, and then what payment product you might use with it. And the idea is maybe to turn this into ultimately not just an understanding tool, but a self-report. And it may be, Ignacio, that something like this underpins some of this sort of collective action bodies that you're talking about. And that there could be some sort of diagnostic, both for consumers themselves, but also us to collect information. So the first thing I needed to do was to say, okay, if I want to ask consumers, what is everything digital that you do? I needed to create a universe. And I decided, okay, I'm going to take government out of it for the moment. I should probably include government, but it gets really sticky. So I just wanted to include private companies. And so I use this thing called Flourish, and let me show you a little bit more. So there's 8 basic domains. And within, for example, e-commerce, there might be browser extensions, and there's Honey from PayPal. There's marketplaces, and this is all based on the US for the moment. We're going to be adapting it for India, which is our next country to pilot. We might have online retail like Amazon, and then we also have transit. We have Lyft and Uber. Other parts of the portfolio might be things like streaming, where we have video, radio, podcasts. We have communications, we've got messaging, email, any sort of like shared space, shared storage. You got dating, which is really big here, at least in the US. You know, there's search engines, there's smart devices, which people are really concerned about these days. How much of smart devices are they picking up about your bio functions or about your voice recognition? Search aggregators, online gaming, mapping, biosample, and health. So that's the universe which I did enough to start the interviews. I'm not saying that I've got the full universe, but I got enough that I thought I was capturing everything that people used. So then I went in and I said, okay, for each product, like when you use online retail, you use Amazon, you need to talk about what channel you're using. Do you use your Wi-Fi at home, your Wi-Fi in public, mobile data, do you use VPN? There's different levels of privacy that provider will either provide you or not. And each provider will do different things with your data. They'll collect different types of data and they'll sell it, or they'll share it, or they'll use it in some other way. And then you might use a different type of device. You might use Android, you might use Apple, you might use a Kindle, you might use a gaming console. And then if you're doing any sort of e-commerce, you're going to use a payment device. You're going to use some sort of payment tool. So when you go to Amazon, you're not just talking about Amazon, you're talking about Amazon and your mobile data, and you're using your Android, and you're going to use a credit card. So there is exposure along 4 different companies, not one. And you need to think about each one of those. And a big part of what I was trying to get at was understanding in detail along somebody's particular portfolio. Because what I learned about with understanding financial management is that when you talk to people, you can't talk about them in general. You have to say, when you do this, you know how you use Amazon and you say that you use Amazon once a week and you tend to use your Wi-Fi at home on your Android and you tend to have a credit card? Well, here's the type of data that Amazon's collecting. Here's what your ISP is collecting. Here's what Android is collecting. And here's what your credit card's collecting. And here's how they use it. So I've only just used one example of each type of data collected, one example of each use, and one example of a risk that they might face. And what I aim to do after I map their portfolio is zero in on the most important, well-used parts of their portfolio, where they were exposing themselves on a daily, intraday, or weekly basis, and then ask them, did you know, here are 3 sets of data that's being collected by this company. Which ones did you know about? That's what I needed, because people would also say, oh yeah, I know all about that. Okay, did you know about this one, and this one? And I didn't know about this one. Or I knew about that data, but I didn't know that they'd used it to do this. Because again, I wanted to get at what are the impressions versus the actual knowledge. And then, well, are you like pissed about that? Are you upset? Or they're like, So they target me with ads. I actually find them helpful. Because that can be some of the responses. So there's the knowledge, and then there's the, does this bother you or not? Does it bother you on the principle of security or privacy? Do you expose me, or manipulation? And any of these responses went from I'm not concerned to I feel violated. And so we tested this methodology in California and Massachusetts, and in phase 2, California and Massachusetts, the edges of the country are sort of more tech educated, et cetera. I want to get the middle of the country, and I want to go a little bit further down the income curve. And then also in phase 2, we're going to, Padmini is going to be doing the same thing, adapted to India. So a whole different set of tools, a whole different set of products, a whole different universe. And then she'll be testing this. So here's the data empowerment interview tool that I hacked together. It's just an Access database, and it just would go through the questions and allow us to map a portfolio. And I found that we could map the portfolio in about 30 minutes. It was a totally possible thing to do. It sounds really overwhelming, but it's not entirely. So here's a profile of Sarah, who is a medical biller. She's in urban San Francisco. She has a bachelor's degree. She uses Android, a PC laptop, so she's more PC than Apple. She uses a Fitbit, an Xbox, a Kindle. She usually uses Wi-Fi at home or mobile data. Credit card, she uses PayPal for eBay. And I also asked about security habits in general, password protected, whether all the passwords are the same. Most people said that their passwords were more or less the same. No judgment, but when we think about the biggest risk exposures of the overall portfolio, we may be able to weight that and say, okay, the number one thing you can do is to make your passwords different. You know, all the other things, there are other things you can do, but this is the worst thing. So here's Sarah's portfolio, and Sarah's portfolio is pretty big. You can see that it sort of fills up the whole screen. Now, when you look at this, and you can't necessarily, you see several times a year here for PayPal, Wi-Fi at home, so she'll do payments through PayPal, but she only does that several times a year. The larger ones, and especially the green ones, so for example, she will do a payment with a debit card on Android once a day. So she'll be paying bills or what have you. The other thing that she does a lot, and I'm gonna show this, is streaming music, which I can't necessarily find in here right now. But, you know, for example, it might be, she does a Amazon streaming, but some of the other ones that she does do sort of YouTube pretty often, and Wi-Fi at home, gaming device, accesses YouTube. Okay, so Sarah has this pretty big portfolio, and you'll notice compared to other portfolios, they only cover like half the circle. And so looking at her philosophies, it's fatalism on some parts, nothing to hide on other parts, trade-offs on others. Sarah's the one who said, I'm going to go and share my DNA because I really care about knowing what my ancestry is. But I really don't want to use Facebook because I don't want to be manipulated. So there's already a trade-off going on in her head. Here's the biggest thing about this knowledge versus fears. So this is Amazon Music, one of her biggest pathways that she uses. So the provider is Amazon Music. So we first said, okay, the provider, Amazon Music, did you know what data is being collected? And through the product themselves, Amazon Music, through the channel, which usually uses mobile data, and through her device, which is Android. And most of the time she said, yes, I know what's being collected. I get it. And then how do you know how the data is being used? Well, she figured when we told her, she said, yeah, I know how Amazon Music is using that data. Oh, I didn't know a few things on Androids, but okay, you know, I knew most of them. She did not know how her channel provider was using her data. She was like, whoa, now I'm surprised. And then how did that make you feel? There's a couple things on this triangle where we talk about, well, how does that make you feel in terms of privacy or manipulation or data security. Now these go in the opposite direction. So in some ways, the tighter circles are good. In other words, I don't feel very manipulated. I don't feel exposed in terms of security, but wow. I really don't know, especially about that channel provider, how I feel about privacy. I feel really differently because I didn't know how they were using my data. Therefore, when you think about one of the most important pathways that she uses all the time, her knowledge about what data is collected and how it's being used, especially among that channel provider, she's feeling like her privacy is being violated. And naturally, people ask, well, what can I do? The answer is, from me, I don't want at this stage to be giving advice. At the next stage, I'd like to say, here's something you can do. And then I'd like to follow up the week later and say, did you do that one thing or not? Because I think that there's a perception that people don't care. I think within technology companies, they say, the one question that PayPal certainly had for me was, do people care? And I think that, yes, somebody's going to do one thing. If you tell them and you isolate where in the portfolio they need to make a change, my hypothesis is that they will do that one thing. Their hypothesis, PayPal, I think, really says, you're crazy. They're not going to do that. It's not what they want to do in that next week. It's a very low priority. It's the boring part of their life. So that is the methodology in phase 2. I want to go back to the US. I want to focus more on the lower income middle. I want to expand some of this thoughts around philosophies and privacies. And I also want to ask about trade-offs in the light of COVID. And then focused on India, adapting the whole universe to India. Obviously, it's not the same as in the US. Mapping digital portfolios in India, comparing it to the US. And then also asking around detailed mental models and, again, the trade-off with respect to COVID. Let me stop there. I haven't left a lot of time, but we have this presentation and you can look at more of the interactive diagrams.
Thanks so much, Gal. It's really fascinating. I'm really finding what you're sharing and the depth of the information that you're collecting is really, really interesting. Like you say, you can't make an assumption that what people are thinking, what people are going to do. This is really digging in deep and actually learning a lot of what people genuinely think. I can see Fahad's got his hand up, so I'm going to ask Fahad to unmute himself and to ask his comment. Fahad.
Yes, thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Daryl. It's quite a fantastic presentation, and I really like the approach which you are taking to find out the overall response from the respondents. One response, if I, being a Pakistani, would like to say about this issue, I want to have what data these social platforms are taking, to whom they are selling, for what amount, and what will be my share.
Yep.
Because
exactly.
why I am saying that if we focus on these 4 things, the whole concept of privacy can be turned around on its head, and we can take control as a customer, as a consumer. So this is my my input, and the best part of your presentation, which I can take, is right now we have in banks chief security officer. I am seeing that within 3 to 4 years there will be a chief privacy officer as well. So I think it's very important, and these type of researches will really make a big impact in the overall situation in privacy and overall customer trust.
You're absolutely right. That's exactly where I'm trying to aim towards, is this idea of empowerment, where people are able to claim back their data. And my hypothesis is that starts from knowledge. I don't know if that's true, and I don't, to be honest. That's part of what I want to understand. It might be true for different people. Like if I know, I can do something about it. But your point about who is selling, what are they making? There's a lot of hypotheses around how much companies are making. It's very obscure. It's also somewhat obscure. You're not supposed to sell, according to the data privacy laws, you're not supposed to sell data, but there are exceptions. So for example, ISPs, internet service providers in my state, Massachusetts, a bill was shot down in January in Massachusetts that would prohibit ISPs from selling data. So my ISPs can sell, we don't know how much they make, my data of how I browse. That's my Wi-Fi provider at home. I don't know why the hell this got shut down, because it's clearly the ISPs have too much control. The what is my share, I think, is going to be something that we're going to be talking about more and more. There's a company here in the US who's very interesting. They ask people to share, for example, their bank transaction data, and they will give them some sort of incentive. And they'll also give them incentive if then you do surveys with them. And I love their philosophy. I don't know how well they're doing, because again, I don't know if this is sort of common practice. But that aspect of people feeling like this is my data, especially for those who are lower income, you know, that it's something of worth. Their information, their behavior. Somebody who's newly digitized may not realize that they have something of value that they can monetize in some small way, which may make a difference to their lives. In some ways, that's part of where I started on this. And your point about chief privacy officer, you're absolutely right. In many of the big technology companies, there already are chief privacy officers. The problem is that their function is more about how do I protect my company to make sure we don't step over the line in the regulations. It's not a business function. It's not a let's design for the consumers so that we protect privacy to enhance trust. That is not happening. You know, organizationally, that revolution has not happened. I'd love to spark some of that.
Thanks so much, Daryl. I want to hop over to another question from MD Ashraful Alam. If you could unmute yourself and ask your question, or us.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, Daryl, for this insightful work. I mean, I'm amazed. I mean, how in depth.
It seems like we might have lost you. Always at the wrong, just at the wrong moment. Okay, let's hop over to Emmanuel, because he's got his hand up. So we'll hop over to Emmanuel, and then hopefully we can come back to MD Ashraful. Emmanuel. Emmanuel, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Oh, we can hear you now.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can.
Okay. Yes, so my question is maybe a little bit off course, but I think it's really very important. So we have this new set of users, okay, of either social media or whatever platform,
Yep,
who are not so literate, digital literacy, or even, you know, ability, not highly educated anyway, but their presence is becoming increasingly very visible online. Whose responsibility is it to really protect, you know, the privacy of these users? So like the question somebody mentioned earlier was, you download an app, for instance, and you are asked before you could use the app to even do anything. You grant access to your photos, to your contacts. You know, and all of that. Whose responsibility, you know, of the privacy laws, you know, privacy statements, you know, that the users of this app, you know, And sometimes to even go and read all of those is really bulky, tiny. But these people, they don't understand whose responsibility to protect them.
That's a great question. And I think we do get back to regulation. And again, as Ignacio was discussing, from what you've been talking about, there probably do need to be watchdogs and consumer bodies. One thing that I found interesting when I started this, I did some interviews in Kenya just to see if there was, a good reason to do these types of interviews in Kenya. And I was just in Nairobi and maybe did 4 interviews. And first of all, I mean, people's digital portfolios they have digital portfolios, even in, the small slums and, people who are only working part-time at a very low salary. They use WhatsApp, they might use Google Maps. They certainly use M-Pesa. So they've got portfolios, digital portfolios that they are using. When I said, are you aware of what you're sharing? They said, well, no. And they said, give me the answers. So I think there is a regulatory solution. I think that education would be helpful. And I think that people care. They will want to protect themselves if the regulations can't. Again, it's a blunt tool. I think it needs to be a combination of aspects. It was interesting in some of the surveys, especially from the governments, from Australia, and then there's one in the UK as well, where that was a question that came up. Whose responsibility is it to protect your privacy? Obviously, there was government, but there wasn't a lot of faith in government, at least not right now. And there was some response of, it's me. So, I mean, that's something I actually would like to ask consumers as well. Whose responsibility do you think it is? And where does that responsibility end? And how much do you think you can do? I mean, the interviews that I'm doing, I can ask all these nitty-gritty questions. So thank you. I think you've given me an idea of probing this more among consumers in my next round of interviews.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yes, you're welcome. But I was thinking a little bit further, because I remember there was a course I did, and Ignacio, really explained to us. I, as an educated person, I can check what kind of information I have exposed, what Google is collecting about me, what Facebook is collecting. There is a way I can even request for monthly downloads of all of this information, right? But I have in the village who all she knows is just to type and reply messages and all of that. Just log on to Google, to Facebook. There are nitty-gritties that in privacy policies I understand better than she does. Okay, yes. And so we talk about digital transformation. We want to get an app, a feature phone in the hands of those who could just use a USSD code to send, and receive money and all of that. But these people, they don't understand the implication. But before they can even benefit from a digital economy that is all inclusive, right? They have to give away their privacy without them even knowing the implication or what it is. So there are 2 types of customers here. The ones that are enlightened or digitally literate or otherwise, okay? Then the ones that don't even have a clue because they are not educated. Mm-hmm. So exactly, protect these persons.
Yep. And it's been the second people that I'm most concerned about. It's the newly digitized, because I mean, coming from the world of financial inclusion, you got this stampede to digitize everybody, and it all makes sense. Yeah. So people are increasingly being digitized, but it's those newly digitized people that I'm particularly worried about. Because when you think about, I mean, all the education around digitization is about how do you get onto digital platforms? None of that education deals with
absolutely
and how do you protect yourself. So I think that it's a couple different pronged approach. I think obviously there's a heavy it's going to be a couple pronged approach. Let me just put it that way. I think that there's a number of different technology applications that you can see what data you're exposing at any one time. But to be honest, all the ones that I've looked at, they haven't been taken up at scale. So I do think that something like that is going to be part of the solution as well. But nobody's stumbled across the right model.
Thanks so much, Daryl. I'm going to take one more question. I know we've got several, but we're over time a little bit already. So just to take our last one, we've got MD Ashraful back on the line with us. Hopefully your internet is okay this time. Please unmute yourself and share with us.
Yeah, thank you. So Daryl, my question is basically, one way to, fight this consumer protection against privacy hack or privacy, unauthorized privacy, hacking, is to make people aware of what the companies or what the people are using their data for. And also, raising voices to make it more understandable to the consumers that for what they are collecting this information and for what purposes they will be using it, and also giving the power to the consumer that okay, you can share my data only with my consent. That consent needs to be informed choice that yes, you can share my data with the third party for my benefit. So this is one also. But my question to you is that what to do with the governments? Not only the companies are collecting data, governments are collecting data, and they are they are using it for not for good purposes in always. They are tracking what kind of political views I am spreading, what kind of communities I am basically mixing up with, what kind of friends I have, and whether those friends are of the same political affiliation or so. What to do with that? Basically this is going to be the larger headache for consumers or people in general, because these digital ID is giving this tool to the government. So what we can do on that?
So your point about consumer education, I think where financial education is kind of interesting, because I think having come from the world of financial inclusion and seeing financial education and how incredibly hard it is, there's especially edutainment has been one of the more effective tools at getting across messages that are very complex about financial systems. However, I don't think that anybody can be educated to the point where they can fully protect themselves. But let me just say that about the protection. The government side, as I mentioned, I did not include government capture of information along different ways, because when I started, my mind blew up because it was so complex. There are so many ways that the government collects so much data. I decided to put it to one side until I determined, yes, I can collect a portfolio. Yes, I can have these conversations with customers. One of the things that I think ultimately I want to do with all of this research is put it in within an academic institution or some sort of an institution that I think will have more power to deal with governments. I think that advocacy with governments are very, very tricky. And so that's where if I can put this research within the right type of environment with other researchers who are used to dealing with data privacy and advocating effectively with government, then that's what I want to do, because I think that that's really hairy, as you're pointing out. I think it's really hairy in order to affect change.
Thanks so much, Daryl. Yeah, I would completely understand that people have different views about governments as well. So what they're willing to disclose or say might be quite different. It's quite a different. So yeah, interesting though. I think to start to dig into that a little bit more as you say when time goes on. And I feel like a lot of people have said they're really super interested to read your research. So I'd like to invite you and Padmini back at some point when you've done your data. It'll be interesting to see, like I know one of the questions was around culture, like will what you find in the US be very different from what you find in India? That might really help inform some of our opinions about, how much privacy is culturally, shaped.
Yep. And
really,
and in a way that isn't reductionist. Oh, we don't care about our data. Well, I don't know.
everybody does. Absolutely, everybody does.
So what is it that's different? I think there's more nuances. So, and that's exactly what Padmini is going to be digging into.
Absolutely. Well, we'll be super excited. We'll definitely have you back for another discussion when that's ready. So do keep in touch with us, Daryl.
Really helpful. Yeah, I want to thank everybody in the discussion. It's been really, really helpful for us as we continue to progress with this work.
And I think it's a really good example for me, how, you're not a lawyer, you're not, a privacy expert, but you're just trying to find out more and you're doing a little bit of research. And that's actually, if we're all keen on understanding what people in our countries or our customers think, we can also do a little bit of research too, to try and find out some of those answers. So you've given us a little bit of a start to a tool that we can use. Maybe as time goes on, some of us will be able to use your tool in countries. When you get to that stage of figuring out, how it can be adapted and work in multiple locations. And I think it'll be very, very exciting and informative for us all. So thank you so much for sharing today. Thank you for everyone for staying on the line. I know we ran out over time a little bit, but I think like everyone, I was so engrossed in the conversation that I don't know what happened to that this last hour and a bit. Daryl, are you happy to share your slides with us?
Yes, please. I had sent them over to you as a PDF with pleasure. Please share them out. And Sarah, I'd love to find some way to sort of gather all the comments that happened on chat and anywhere else. That'd be really helpful for me.
I've been scribbling notes away. So we'll be summarizing everything that we talked about, and I'll make sure that you get a copy of that too, Daryl. And for everyone on the call, I'll put a copy of the PowerPoint slides when I put the copy in the same place that I'm going to put a copy of the recording of today's session as well, so that you can all reach it too. Just a quick reminder from me, we are closing our online aspect of the discussion on Sunday at 11:59 p.m. South African time. So you can still go on and comment or even ask questions amongst yourselves from tomorrow and over the weekend. And then a sort of a bigger final summary will come out from all 3 days as well. So I'll start that process so that you can all comment and share and add to it until Sunday. And then next week we'll put something a little bit lengthier together so that we have a record of all the different things, the suggestions, the challenges, the issues that we've discovered over the last 3 days. It really is a balancing act. It's a pro of con. It's trying to figure out, what is going on. And that's what I think I loved so much about your research style. It didn't assume that because I'm unhappy to share my data with someone like Facebook, it also means I feel the same way about everybody else, because actually there are many nuances that we can't make those assumptions. So to some of the challenges with privacy, we're still, Ignacio and I are still going to be in the classroom, so do connect to our campus and chat with us there. And thank you everyone. And yeah, one last thing, we've got an evaluation to do as well, so I'll be sending you it's in the classroom, and B, in the email that I'm going to send you this evening. So do let us know your thoughts, because if this has been great, we'll run more.